Good evening. Hello. Item 1 is the election of the Chair. Can I please have nominations for the position of Chair of the Streets, Environment and Homes Scrutiny Subcommittee for the 2017-18 municipal year?
I second.
Okay. Are there any further nominations? Okay. Can the nomination of Councillor Sean Fitzsimons to be Chair of the Streets, Environment and Homes Scrutiny Subcommittee be put to the vote? Agreed. Thank you. Councillor Sean Fitzsimons has been elected Chair for the 2017-18 municipal year.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I feel like Sarah Jones. You know, odds-on favourite, you know. Okay, so that's the last political thing we'll mention, or party political thing we'll mention all year. We won't dwell on other people's disappointments. So let's move on to the appointment of Vice Chair. So item 2, for the 2017-18 municipal year, I appoint Councillor Jan Buttiger to be the Vice Chair of Streets, Environments and Home Scrutiny Subcommittee. Now that we've got the election of Chair and Vice Chair out of the way, I need to do the sort of housekeeping rules. Just remind members and officers and members of the public about mobile phones. You're asked to leave the meeting if you wish to make or receive a telephone call, but you can text or tweet in the meeting. Please, can you refer to the pack page numbers rather than the report numbers if asking a question? If you plan to refer to a specific page in a report or appendix, use the pack page number on the bottom right-hand side rather than report page numbers, as this will help ensure that all of us can find the correct page quickly. Please note that this meeting is being filmed for live and subsequent broadcast by the Council's internet site. Generally, the public seating areas are not filmed. However, by entering the meeting room, you are consenting to being filmed and to the use of those images and sound recordings being used for the purposes described. The webcasting system uses a signal from the microphone system, so members are reminded to please use a microphone provided to ensure that your contribution is recorded, particularly on the webcast. Please also turn the microphone off again when you finish speaking. Just a reminder, including to myself, that this meeting is now a paperless meeting. Members will be should be accessing their papers through their electronic devices, unless, of course, they forget their charging cable. And finally, if the fire alarm sounds, you are asked to leave the meeting by the nearest available exit. Okay, so on to the main parts of the meeting, of the agenda. So item 3, apologies for absence.
Apologies have been received from Councillor Pat Clowder.
Thank you. Minutes of the last meeting. Minutes of the meeting held on the Tuesday, 28th of March can be found on pack page 1 of the agenda. There are a number of us who attended that meeting. Can I sign them off as a true and correct record? Agreed? Agreed. Item 5, disclosure of interest. The committee need only disclose any interests that do not appear on their annual register of interest. If required at any point during the meeting, forms can be obtained from the Member Services Manager. Item 6, which is urgent business, there is none. Item 7, which is about the committee membership. Can I ask the committee to note the committee membership for the Streets, Environment and Home Scrutiny Subcommittee for the 27-18 municipal year? Okay. Okay, so we're on to item 8, the cycling strategy, which can be found at pack page 11 of the report. I will hand this over to Councillor Stewart-King. If you could introduce your colleagues and officers on this item, and then I understand there's a couple of presentations.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Councillor Stewart-King, Cabinet Member for Transport and Environment. Robert, do you want to introduce yourself?
Councillor Robert Canning. I'm Councillor King's deputy. I think I've appeared in the committee before as a former deputy cabinet member for Transport and Environment, but it's great to be back.
Stephen Tate, Director of District Centres and Regeneration.
Rachel Flowers, Director of Public Health. Heather Cheeseborough, Director of Planning and Strategic Transport.
Ian Plowright, Head of Strategic Transport.
Tom Sweeney, Walking and Cycling Programme Manager.
Paul Lowe, cyclinginstructor.com. We're the cycle training providers.
Craig Collins, cyclinginstructor.com.
Austin Cooper, Secretary, Croydon Cycling Campaign.
We might as well introduce the rest of the committee, because there's going to be people here who may not know who we are. So, Councillor Thomas, would you like to go first?
Yeah, Councillor Phil Thomas.
Councillor Patricia Hay, Justice Addiscombe.
Councillor Joy Prince, Warden Ward.
Victoria Lowe, Clerk to the Committee.
And Sean Fitzsimons, I'm as Chair, but also Councillor in the Addiscombe Ward.
Councillor Jan Battinger, Councillor for Kenley.
Okay. So over to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Chair. So Ian Plowright's going to deliver the presentation. I'm happy at your invitation or at the committee's invitation to answer any questions you might have around kind of leadership and political strategy around the overall cycling strategy.
Apologies, Chair. I was just going to ask Victoria if she was going to be the one moving the slides on for me. Thank you. I was going to start by saying a very little bit about the benefits to be derived from cycling. The benefits are very wide-ranging, both to the individual and to the area in which cycling takes place. They range through congestion relief to air quality improvement. But the one I've intended to touch on in a little more detail is that of the health benefits to be derived from cycling. I'm fortunate in a way that a piece of work has been undertaken by TfL and the Walking and Cycling Commissioner quite recently, and has done that work for me to give some facts and figures as to the health benefits to be derived. This is taken from TfL London Mayor's document on healthy streets published in February. It highlights, though, that more than 40% of Londoners do not achieve the recommended levels of activity each week, and that's having a profound effect on Londoners' health and the resulting cost consequences. As the Cycling Commissioner said there, and Walking Commissioner, and he said almost without realising it, we've engineered a physical activity out of our daily lives. And I think as you only have to look at the Croydon town centre to see a place where we've re-engineered an environment that makes physical activity, particularly cycling, but also walking, difficult to achieve. Next slide, please, Victoria. Taken from the same document, a few useful and, I'd say, telling statistics. The one that struck home to me is there on the right with a small bike next to it. A half of all car trips could actually be cycled within 10 minutes. On the left, there's figures indicating the benefits to be derived through being active as part of your daily routine. And I think Rachel may correct me, but I think those are general figures for people who are walking, etc. But for cycling, those benefits are even greater. If you could move to the next slide, please. In the draft strategy that's appended to the report, there is some work taken from TfL on barriers to cycling. To my mind, I think there are three key ones, which I would say are safety, access to cycling or cycle availability, and one important to Croydon, that's topography. But something when we discussed a draft cycle strategy with the Cycle Forum, the forum highlighted is a cycle culture or lack of it. And I think there are links between each of those circles and culture, but I'm going to focus on the outer circles briefly now. Victoria, thank you. Cycling is actually very safe. These are national figures, and the top one illustrates just how far one can cycle without risk of death. And as we look at the second bullet point, the good news is that the more people cycle, the safer it becomes, the lower the risk. Something Heather's referred to as critical mass, and I think safety in numbers. However, it's not how people perceive it. The last bullet point is a national figure as well, and significant number, a great proportion of non-cyclists believe that cycling is too dangerous for them. And TfL research attitudes to cycling in London every 2 years, and I think those concerns are slightly higher amongst Londoners. Next slide, please. The good news is, though, there are a number of ways to overcome those real perceived road danger worries. I'd suggest that the key one is good quality cycle routes, either routes following quieter streets or, if they are on busier corridors, then with some segregation or semi-segregation. 20-mile-an-hour limits and zones have their placed a significant role to play potentially, but as the Cycle Forum pointed out, there needs to be enforcement to go with them to maximise their effectiveness. Something the strategy recognises is that there needs to be improvement to a number of junctions across the borough. One of the vehicles or vehicle types that pose the most danger, most risk to cyclists has been big vehicles, in particular lorries. Fortunately, there have been a number of initiatives seeking to address this. So there's a freight operator recognition scheme. There's a similar one specifically for construction logistics, a clock scheme. We, Croydon, have been leaders in promoting construction logistics planning, and it's something we're rolling out in detail and heavily within the town centre, and that can involve lorry routing. There's also lorry design and construction. We have the Safer Lorry scheme in London at the moment, and TfL is moving towards a direct vision standard for future lorries in the capital. And of course, the council should be leading by example through its own vehicles and through its contracting and procurement. TfL itself can be doing its bit with its bus company through bus driver training and awareness raising. And there's a key role to be played by developing people's cycle skills, both as children but as adults, through bikeability and Bike It and skills building led rides. Next slide, please, Victoria. The next topic I'll address briefly is topography. This is an image taken from a toolkit you can all go onto the web and use. It's produced by the DFT. It looks at cycling potential and it uses census data to work information. And it's not a poor scan. The image looks a bit crinkly because that's trying to show the actual topography. What this slide, though, is showing the current journey to work mode share, and the deep red is showing where the cycle mode share is between 0 and 1%. As we get into the orange, we begin to improve slightly, get up towards the 1 and 3%, etc., within Croydon and the neighbouring boroughs. If you go to the next slide, one of the scenarios you can run on the Cycling Potential website is to look at what would Croydon or anywhere else look like if we had Dutch levels of cycling. Again, cycling to work based on similar distance to work, etc., but also taking accounts of topography. Here we can see getting into the blue with much higher levels of cycling if we were all to behave like the Dutch, but still in effect going on where we have the hills in the south and up towards Upper Norwood. If we go to the next slide, another scenario you can run is, well, what if everyone were to use an e-bike, an electric bike, which both increases distance but also gets over the topography barrier. And there we begin to see, well, most of the borough now being washed blue in terms of cycling potential. If we can flip to the next slide. I suggest a way, though, that the strategy can overcome the topography is by confidence building and fitness building led rides. People, I think, their initial reaction was, oh, I wouldn't be able to get over that hill. I'd say that's both down to lack of confidence and fitness, but that confidence and fitness can quickly be built. Another one is through cycle loan, giving advice on cycle choice. And finally, again, a key one I suggest is e-bikes, and perhaps a role specifically in Croydon for promoting their use. The next slide, Victoria. The third area that I feel is a barrier to cycling is low access to bikes. And previously, when the scrutiny subcommittee looked into barriers to cycling in Croydon, they received evidence on just how low ownership is in Croydon. At the time, I think Croydon had the second lowest availability of bicycles per household of any London borough bar one. Related to that, or compounding that, maybe a lack of secure cycle space to keep a bike at home, and then there's also the issue of having safe, secure cycle parking at the journey's end. Next slide, please. Ways of addressing that could be, one thing we've tried was what we call cycle heroes. We work with businesses and through the annual business fair to try and engage employees in Croydon to encourage them to begin to own a bike, take cycle training and get cycling. We put in a lot of effort with cycle shops to promote the scheme. However, I think one of the things we did learn was it's probably more efficient simply to promote the national scheme, the Cycle to Work scheme. Other authorities, including a neighbouring authority to ours, Lewisham, have a cycle loan scheme where someone considering taking up cycling can rent a bike at very low cost for a short period and give it a try. And one thing we've begun to roll out in Croydon and we'll be rolling out further is cycle hire in the form of a Brompton dock. But a Brompton has the advantages it's relatively low cost and can be taken home and used for a few weeks to begin to give cycling a try. And an initiative that looks quite impressive in Yorkshire is one called Bicycle Libraries. In Yorkshire, they now have 40 libraries. They've had 5,000 second-hand bikes donated, and it's provided so far the opportunity for 36,000 children to loan and trial a bike. The next slide, please, Victoria. One of the things that we are doing is requiring new residential development to have cycle parking to the London Plan standards, but they are quantity standards, not quality standards. And in an existing residential development, we are seeking to backfill the lack of cycle parking through providing cycle hangers on council estates. And we'll begin to look more widely to provide it on street at non-council development. When it comes to parking at the journey's end, we are beginning to roll out Sheffield stands on street. We require, again, through the planning process, visitor parking at new development or certain types of new development. And we're beginning to roll out ourselves visitor parking at existing destinations. There's an example of the Croydon-designed cycle port recently gone in at a cycle shop down in the south of the borough. And whilst it's not quite the journey's end, there's a very big role to be played at cycle parking, bicycle parking at stations. I'd say that those are all components. Addressing each of those barriers can each help begin to bring about a cycling culture, but they won't fully do it by themselves. And at this point, I don't know if possibly Heather has got anything else you might want to say about a cycling culture.
Thank you, Ian. I think I've been very lucky because I was brought up in a place where everybody cycled. It was part and parcel of what you did. I was brought up in Cambridge, and if anyone ever goes there, you just see the vast quantities of people on cycles. They are seen as a completely viable, sensible, normal way of transport. And I think, in terms of culture, that's what we need to do. We need to normalise cycling. People need to think before they set out on a journey, how am I going to make this journey? And run through their mind the range of modes instead of just reverting to the car. And so in respect of that, there's a number of things we can do and points to think about. We need to be able to communicate that actually cycling is a very, very quick way of getting about. I think people who don't cycle don't quite understand how easy it is to get on a bike and cycle a relatively long distance very quickly. But you need to also, when you do make that journey, think to yourself, and pick up on some of the points that Ian was saying, you need to be able to park your cycle quick, safely, very close to where you want to go. I mean, that's one of the delights of cycling. As you jump on your bike, you can cycle right up to the shop and that you want to park outside. You don't want to have to park it miles down the street. So the provision of decent cycle parking is really very important, and it's important that that cycle parking is secure and overlooked so that you know that when you get out, your bicycle will still be there. It's also important that if you are going to use cycling as a main mode of transport, that you will be able to get to your destination, and that it will be that you can change and that you can store your helmet, or you can perhaps just tidy yourself up. And that's something that we're seeking to do through the planning process, to make sure there are facilities to change. And it's just getting across, I think, really the whole thing about getting a critical mass of people onto bicycles. Because when you have a critical mass, like in cities like Cambridge and Oxford, you feel safe and secure to do it. You don't feel that you're a lone person out there. It's a very, very normal thing to do. So I think that's what we really seek to do, is to normalise the whole process so that people see cycling as part and parcel of their daily life, and a very sensible and sane mode of transport. Thank you.
Is that the end of the presentations? Okay, thank you, Heather and Ian, for the presentation. I should point out that this strategy has yet to go to Cabinet, so this is pre-decision scrutiny. So it's a paper that you have brought to this committee to allow people to add comments, so that you will potentially amend or take into account comments, or is this the final version?
Chair, no, it's far from the final version. We took our sort of outline thinking to the Cycle Forum to get input directly from them. We were bringing it here to scrutiny for your input, and then the expectation is we would then proceed to consult on the cycling strategy once that process is complete.
So similar to how we dealt with the air quality. Okay. What I'd like then to do is to bring in some of the other people who have attended this evening. So, Neil, could you just introduce yourself, what your Wheels for Wellbeing... Craig, I've got the wrong tick. Craig from Croydon Bikeability. Do you just want to... it'd be good to get an understanding from you about the role of what is bikeability, because some of us know what it's about, but I'm sure people watching the webcast may not know.
If that's okay. I'm good.
So, Paul, you're going to... Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, bikeability is a nationally agreed scheme backed by the DFT and all the major cycling organisations. Some of you may remember cycling proficiency. Sorry. Is that better? So, bikeability is the nationally agreed scheme for training cyclists. Some of you may remember cycling proficiency when you were growing up, if you're my age, and it's the successor of that concept. And it's backed by the Department for Transport and all the major cycling organisations like British Cycling and the Cyclists Touring Club, as it used to be called. And in Croydon, we run a large scheme for schools, and in the last financial year we trained 2,945 children. Roughly 60 to 70% of all primary schools participate. You do get a bit of churn each year, it's not the same each year. And and in comparison with many other London boroughs, outer London boroughs, we do very well. The other strand of what we do is adults, so that's defined as being over 16 and over. And the adults programme comprises a cycling on referral project which runs at Croydon Arena, so that is specifically concerned with public health, and that runs every Monday throughout the year, and we get upwards, in the summer we might get 35 people attending that. So basically it's kind of pulmonary rehab on a bike. And it's done in partnership with, well, originally with the NHS and now with public health. The other programmes we do is adult cycle training. In London, that's kind of rebranded as Cycle Skills. And once again, we train very considerable numbers each year for adult cycle training. The adult cycle training is really trying to address people using bikes as a form of transport. That's its key form. Though Croydon, has quite low levels of cycle commuting, I think the numbers that we are training do demonstrate there's huge potential demand for making more journeys by bike. I just thought I'd dig out some nice quotes as well. This is from a recent TfL document, which, hang on a second, is called the Analysis of Cycling Potential, which, if you have a chance, is worth reading. And this is from the conclusions. So the most significant barrier to realising this potential is that most cyclable trips are made by people that do not cycle at all. We need to encourage people who don't cycle to start. So there is the justification for doing lots of complete beginners, which we do in quite big numbers. And then the second quote is, most potentially cyclable trips across London either start or finish at home. It is therefore crucial that people feel comfortable cycling on local streets near their homes and have places to store their cycles. And so therefore that's the justification for doing one-to-ones where we start and finish at people's homes and not just do groups, big groups where they come together at the arena, for instance. There's lots of other things we do, but that will do as a summary. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Rachel Flowers, our Director of Public Health, because one element of this is obviously health, and it seems appropriate that we should ask the Director to just have a couple of minutes on this issue.
Thank you very much. And I apologise I couldn't come to the air quality scrutiny last time, although this is relevant in terms of the quality of our air as well by reducing the amount of vehicles on the road as well. There's lots of evidence around the health benefits of cycling, quite a lot because people don't necessarily think that cycling is about improving their health. Often it's just about a way to move from A to B. But actually, speaking as somebody who did grow up in a cycling environment, but now being a woman in my 50s, actually, and one of the people who are less likely to cycle, I think it's actually important to look at the barriers about why people don't, because despite the fact that it improves the cardiac health and despite the fact that it may improve breathing or reduce dementia or actually improve the chances of your survival around breast cancer, or although we focus around the number of people killed by cycle accidents, we don't focus on the number of people whose lives are saved because they cycle. But actually, despite that, we do have the other barriers. And one of the things I'm particularly impressed about the whole package of Croydon's cycling strategy is it actually is looking around the issues about where you park your bike, where you store your bike, actually the issues of those awful junctions, all those damn big lorries that go far too close around there. Because actually, while it's important we encourage to have a safe cycle ride for young people, true, it actually should be for all of us is that actually many of us will remember that used to be a time where people, as a matter of course, jumped on their bike and cycled to work, and we need to get back to that. But actually people won't do that unless they feel that all the other barriers are. We know that is that despite the health benefits, is that actually if people are feared that they can't do this. So I wanted to say that the health benefits are captured around this, but there's nothing like a psychosocial barrier to stop people like, well, many of us, not some of the people on the end perhaps, but many of us who think twice around cycling around Croydon. I've cycled around on a Brompton bike within Croydon, and actually looking around this, I would welcome the strategy, because we need to get more people who don't do that as well.
Thank you. Ian, could you just give a couple of minutes on behalf of, yes? Sorry, Austin, I don't know why I call you Ian, it's just Austin, Austin, yes, Austin.
We look so much alike. Thank you. I'd like to welcome the introduction of the strategy. It's something I've felt for many years has been important. And looking back, Croydon, many years ago with Adrian Dennis, as a forward writer, did have a cycling strategy. Unfortunately, it gathered dust and did little else. So I'm hoping this one is actually going to be more productive in terms of its outcome. Prompted by the rail strikes last year, I decided to cycle from my home in Wadden to my place of work in Vauxhall. And I think that's largely made possible by investment in infrastructure, which is cycling speak for things like segregated cycle lanes, which have made Vauxhall once a death trap for people cycling, into something that's actually quite safe and agreeable. And some of the quiet ways, say in parts of Streatham, cutting across Tooting Beck Common. The difficult part of my journey was always a ride through Croydon up towards Norbury, and it's regrettable that the health benefits which have been stated are denied to people because they justifiably feel that they're in danger by riding a bike around Croydon. And I found my journey, particularly through Croydon, quite stressful. You have to keep aware all the time. You realise a moment's loss of concentration by yourself or some other idiot driving a car could actually cost you your life. And so we need to get infrastructure right. We need to enable people to realise the health benefits of cycling. And at the moment, we don't have that in place. Culture's been mentioned, and I think one of the things we need to do is stop demonising cyclists, in inverted commas. We're not law-breaking road tax non-paying people. We're people who are exercising transport choice. We've had lots of reports in the past, biking borough and things like that, so it's important that we get this particular document to spearhead a renaissance of dedication to make cycling possible in Croydon. And cycling isn't something you do, you don't. It's not about being multimodal, I ride a bike and don't do anything else. Most people who have got a bike actually own a car and use things like their own feet to walk. They take a train, they do lots of other things. So it's about transport choice. It's not making cycling compulsory. And we've heard all the benefits. I won't go into detail about the benefits of cutting pollution and congestion, improving public health and the air quality and benefits to the local economy. We want to see a focus, I think, on the town centre so people can cycle to and through Croydon. It's a centre of employment, it's a centre of commerce, it's a place of leisure, and increasingly it's a place of residence. If all the people who are going to move into the redeveloped flats had cars and places to park for them, Croydon would grind to a halt. When the big school opens on London Road in West Croydon, if everybody who goes to school there is picked up by car and delivered there by their parents in the morning, that's going to grind to a halt. You need to give people transport choice, and that's what this is all about, I feel. I'd like to see the strategy embrace and emphasise a rebid for the Mini Holland package, which was put together under the previous administration, under the Conservatives. Because I think that was a very worthy bid, and it was sad that it fell at the first hurdle when it went to City Hall. We were told that it wasn't because it was a poor bid, but because Croydon had a lousy reputation for spending what money it had been given on cycling schemes. So we need to reverse that trend. And we need to look at ways that we can bring money in these scarce times. We've got lots of regeneration projects, the Section 106 Community Infrastructure Levy, and putting money in the local infrastructure plan. Looking back, Tramlink was introduced in the 90s with cross-party support. both Labour and Conservative councillors were very much in favour of it, and that's why it went ahead. And it didn't matter who was elected and who got into power, it still went through and has enjoyed cross-party support since. And I think we should get this particular scheme, this cycling transport strategy, should enjoy support from both sides of this House. Thank you.
I just want to check if there's any other officer or anyone else wants to make any comments before we go into the questions.
Hi, thank you for having me. So my name's Neil, I'm from Wheels for Wellbeing. We're an inclusive cycling charity based in Brixton. So if you haven't heard of us before, basically we were founded in 2007, and in a nutshell what we do is we put on inclusive cycling sessions for disabled and older people around a number of venues in Lambeth, Lewisham and Croydon. Each year we reach about 12 to 1,300 disabled people, aged from 2 to 102. So in terms of the people we reach, you know, it's really diverse. We've primarily been a service delivery organisation for the last year, or the last few years, sorry. But in the last kind of 8-9 months or so, we've become an increasingly more of a campaigning organisation. We released a mini manifesto called Beyond the Bicycle last year, and essentially what we called for in that with 3 policy asks of better infrastructure, better facilities and better recognition for disabled cyclists, which I feel kind of really echo with what's already been said today in terms of improving cycling infrastructure, cycling facilities like cycle parking, and particularly the point that was made a minute ago about culture as well. One thing we've done recently is we conducted a really big audit of all the cycling strategies of all the London boroughs, or the boroughs that did have them. And we were looking at basically references made to disabled people as cyclists and the extent to which non-standard cycles, and by that I mean things like tricycles, tandems and hand cycles, were actually mentioned in those strategies. And what we found was that of all the references made to cycles in borough strategies, only 1% of all those references were of non-standard cycles. We did another audit of local implementation plans, and we found that of the references made to disabled people in LIPS, only 1% of those references were to disabled people as cyclists. So the overwhelming majority of times disabled people are perceived as either car drivers or pedestrians, essentially. So I guess our main kind of point is that disabled cyclists currently aren't really recognised in cycling culture at all. Our kind of main campaign is about, and the main thing that we feel that could really kind of generate kind of movement around this is about recognising cycles as a mobility aid. So what I mean by that is obviously most mobility aids you think of would either be a wheelchair or a mobility scooter or perhaps a guide dog. These are things that disabled people commonly use as the mobility aid to help them to get around. But so far as we can see, virtually no one has given any thought to the idea that a cycle might also be used as a mobility aid. So we've had increasing calls and emails in from people in London saying they've been asked to dismount by police officers for instance, using a tricycle along a footpath in an area which traditionally would be a non-cycling area where you have, you know, the cyclist dismount sign. So what we're calling for is legislative change around that, because in current legislation, cycles aren't listed as a mobility aid. So for us, that's kind of the key barrier. If we're going to pick one barrier that's preventing more disabled people from cycling, it's gaining that recognition of cycles as mobility aid. But we know that the kind of potential for more disabled people cycling is huge. You know, disabled people are half as likely as non-disabled people to be physically active. They're more likely to rely on private transport and taxi hire and so on. So, you know, by getting more disabled people into cycling, it could be massively beneficial for all kinds of reasons. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to go around and ask people, have you got any questions first? So if you want to indicate. Patricia.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive, certainly comprehensive presentation. The report itself, from what the presentation I should start off with, it was certainly interesting. It's good to hear the figures, the GLA figures. It puts things in perspective. The 50% of car trips that can be taken in 10 minutes, and things like that, that was generally useful. What I would like to see more of is a thing specific for Croydon as well, because of course I assume that this is all these 10-minute trips, or the 40% of Londoners don't achieve the recommended 150 minutes. All well and good, but it would be great to see the departments work very well together, much more closely, I should say, together. Example, yourselves and Rachel Flower's department coming together so we can get some really key figures for health in that report. The reason why I say that, Sean knows that, yes, as a mother of two, had 2 young children, very reliant on my car. Extremely reliant, and I'm not going to comment on some of the road trips that I've had. And yes, it's great to see an increase in cyclists, but I think I'm just thinking of the individuals that Rachel Flowers mentioned. Some of those individuals, you mentioned the 50-year-old women, the example, older people. It would be great to get some recommendations what could be done about these individuals. And funnily enough, when I was mayor, I actually visited Wheels for Wellbeing, and it was brilliant to see so many different people from different backgrounds using various types of cycles. And at the time, they were cycling in a designated spot. And I know the ideal would be to go out and cycle anywhere. But the other thing that was a massive eye-opener at the time was older people, elderly people, were also taking advantage of the scheme that you run. And it was amazing to see, again, this thing that you talk about, isolation, Rachel, combating isolation. I saw older people coming and talking, and actually I know I went on a cycle and I hadn't been for many years, I have to confess, and it was brilliant to just cycle round and talk at the same time, and didn't appreciate how many times I'd actually been around this rather vast track. So I'm sure there's a great deal of wonderful health and other benefits that really could be capitalised on, and maybe people like me could be looking at that and thinking, goodness, you know what, I really should be doing something about this situation. It's not that I haven't looked and thought this is great, but I'm just thinking there's a real push specific for Croydon as well, that we could really be, yes, encouraging those individuals, not just looking at a wide stream, you know, everybody as one individual, but targeting the elderly, targeting the different, I'm just thinking of the racial profile as well, individuals going out. But that's the first thing I just wanted to mention. And in fact, I've got quite a few things, so I don't really want to go on all night. I'd rather just leave it as that for now and come back.
Follow that up, because actually one of my questions, so I just added in that on a previous visit to another borough, I think it was Hackney, when we were looking at 20 mile an hour, we met the cabinet member there who's from, I think, the Kurdish community, who said that when she bought a bicycle, her mother was aghast because, as a status symbol, the car was a sign of success. Having a big four-wheel drive, driving around, was something that her mum would be proud of her daughter. And the idea that her daughter was riding a bicycle was a bit of a letdown until she explained to mum that it was quite an expensive bicycle. But if you look at the figures for the BME community, and it has been criticism that, you know, in a sense that a lot of cycling seems to be aimed at, you know, guys, you know, who's had a midlife crisis, and have got into Lycra. And things have moved on from that. But for my own observation of someone who cycles around London, I wouldn't say that if you were to draw up to a group of cyclists in the centre of London, that they are reflective of the community of London in terms of the composition. I've been reading through your paper and just looking through it, just again now, to see on page 25, where you've got your Appendix 1, which is creating a cycling culture and changing behaviour, and to pick up Patricia's point about the BME community, is where in there are we going to have something about engagement among communities where, where it may be very aspirational to drive a car, and as we've mentioned, a lot of the journeys that have been taken are very short journeys, which could be cyclable. So what is our engagement strategy in terms of that, or is it something that you guys are still thinking about?
Can I just offer a few words before the officers come in, perhaps on some of the detail? I mean, clearly one of the factors that we've had to take into account is the resources available to us, but I think the other thing that we've taken into account is where is the potential to have the biggest impact, positive impact, quickest. And so, TfL's own data suggests that Croydon is the London borough with the greatest potential for an increase in cycling. So that's a positive. We've got something like around 400,000 cyclable journeys a year, and currently about 6,000 of them are taking place on a bike. So about 1.5% of the potential. So I think you'll see, if you look at the detail of the strategy or what's emerging, is the focus is in and around the town centre, because I think that is where we have the greatest impact. We're kind of recognise the topography challenges in the south of the borough. And I think the priority is to focus there first, with a view to then tackling some of those harder to win over potential cyclists, to kind of refer to Heather's point about normalising cycling.
Except, I have to say, I just want to come back. I'm not disagreeing with any of that, except that if you look at the communities that are around the town centre, particularly on the north side, in places like Sellers and Addiscombe, who are within that cyclable distance, and then you go over to West Thornton and Broad Green, they have significant numbers of people within the BME community. And I'm just not seeing anything in there that says, what is our strategy to engage in there? Or it doesn't, I mean, easy wins are great, but, we are looking for the health benefits, and actually there's evidence to show that within those communities, health benefits are needed more because there are higher levels of diabetes and other issues within that.
If I could come back. We've got to start somewhere. At the moment, we only have a very small number. A part of it is about the infrastructure. A part of it is about the process around this. Certainly as Director of Public Health, of course, I want it to be inclusive. But actually, at the moment, it's not even if. We haven't got this. There is the next days around. It's not just about cycling. One of my friends at the age of 46 learnt to cycle, so actually some people haven't learnt to cycle, but we've got to start somewhere. Actually, there's been significant amounts of modelling with Transport for London with my colleagues. I've worked very closely with Lucy Saunders, who's the public health specialist, who now goes around globally, looking around the modelling around this. And actually, at the moment, we haven't even started to reach our potential because we haven't got the basics there. And while I think there absolutely needs to be, an all-encompassing that allows the opportunity, Councillor Hay, Justice, for yourself, is actually, before we get there, we've got to start with the basics. So I think it's important to do that, and you're quite right to challenge us as officers. My concern is that often around these things, with Hackney, and they've been doing this for a very, very long time, they started small and they built up. What we're seeing within Hackney is something they've been doing over many years. I do have to say that Lucy Saunders is actually also a resident of Hackney as well, which probably doesn't hurt. But these things do not happen straight away. And the fact that Transport for London has identified Croydon as the biggest potential around this, and the quick wins actually will jump-start around this, is that we can't normalise it unless we've actually got places where people feel are safe. And actually the point for those of us who have cycled only a couple of times, not in Lycra, because I don't do Lycra, but kind of like he's smiling. I could do Lycra, but I choose not to. Actually, it is scary, is actually in places of London where there are more people like me, kind of like, it is less scary. When it's less segregated, more segregated, it is less scary. Actually, for those of us who actually are comfortable around cycling, but need a little bit of encouragement, get us on the roads and then start looking at people who've never actually thought around cycling. Ultimately, it will be, and absolutely we need to talk around how we become inclusive. But this isn't something that happens overnight. This is a long period of time.
It's only touched on very lightly within the draft strategy, and that's the suggestion or proposal to undertake individual household travel planning. The suggestion is to undertake that in the area with the greatest potential here around the town centre and to the north. But another reason for it is it's an area with where there are groups of people known to be living who have the greatest propensity to cycle, only needing the slightest nudge. The reason was to go into those areas, work with individual households, try and understand what are the barriers getting them on their bike, and explain to them what's available to them to help them get on their bike and offer them assistance to get cycling, but also to walk and to use public transport. But I'd say it's in those areas as well that we have groups who are really underrepresented amongst cycling. The same household travel planning can be used to learn more about those cultural barriers to cycling, but also to try and offer tailored motivation to overcome those barriers. So personally, I think that individual travel planning is a win-win. We learn more about the barriers and are able to tailor the travel planning to the needs of different groups and communities within the area that's being applied. I don't know if Paul might want to say something about women taking up cycle training in Croydon.
So I've just got to get near again. So a couple of points. The figures on gender and cycle training are that about 70% of all participants are women. So it's almost the exact reverse of what you see on the road, where only 20% are women. So what I think that indicates is that, you know, women have tremendous enthusiasm for learning how to cycle. And I think that once the barriers are removed, then you'll begin to see a much more equity around that. The second point is that for the last 4 years, we've been running a project with the Lake Foundation, who are a BME charity in Croydon, which was a social cycling group. And that was running once a week during Easter through to October. They started off by using our pool bikes at the arena and then went on to get their own funding from the London Cycling Campaign, and are now a self-sustaining group. And they were identified, basically we emailed every voluntary sector group on the council's database and found them that way. And, you know, that kind of outreach work is what needs to be done in terms of reaching these much more difficult, less visible groups. So, I mean, I do think it may not be explicit in the strategy, but implicitly and below the radar, there is a lot of work going on.
Ian?
Thank you. I want to decry the efforts to reach out to different groups, because we need to move away from the stereotype of a middle-aged man in Lycra cycling on a racing bike. you see me dressed the way I am. This is how I cycle on my hybrid bike to work. But I think the real issue then is that you could go out and canvass loads of people as to the benefits of cycling and ask them why they don't. And I think it's fairly simple. That they don't do it because they're in fear of danger from the roads as they currently are. And so I stress the need to invest in infrastructure to make it safe, so that some of the things we've already got in parts of the borough, joining the dots as I would put it, so little contraflows in parts of Wadden and things like that, and some of the things we've seen in the town centre are instrumental to making that happen. And I mentioned the school earlier in London Road opposite the Lidl. What would make that safe to cycle? Well, fairly obviously, from the scenes you've seen, say, at parts of Vauxhall Bridge and along the embankment to Parliament, we know what works. So it's having the political courage to deliver that kind of, it's so safe to let your kids cycle to school and for you to cycle to work or to the shops, because the things that make it safe are in place. So we need to have that. The last thing is we've still got culture on the television screen at the moment. And I mentioned earlier about not demonising cyclists as lawbreakers. I think one of the things we tolerate too much, and the Prime Minister only recently was talking about not tolerating extremism, I think we tolerate too much the kind of driving which intimidates people and endangers their lives. Grange Road in Thornton Heath is a great example of that, where time after time after time you get people driving down too fast and crashing and ending up in people's gardens. How often are these people arrested? How often are they prosecuted for that kind of offence? We should be putting a stop to that, because that changing that culture, they're driving like a lunatic around Croydon and putting yourself and other people in mortal danger, that should be knocked on the head.
I mean, I have to say, I mean, in my own ward, Davison Road, which is a good road for cycling, except, of course, it's where people like to speed. Another question, Don?
Well, I'd like not just to ask a question, but also to make a comment. And that is that there's one element, to my mind, is missing from all the papers that we've looked at regarding the cycling issue. And that is the return from cyclists. What is happening is major sums, millions of pounds, it is planned to spend of taxpayers and Section 106 money, which is from developers, which is to go to the benefit of the community, not for a single pressure group. What has to go alongside the changes, which I'm not opposed to. I support cycling, but I also don't look at it through blurred eyes. I look at reality, and there are not large numbers of people who are cycling, and safety is a paramount concern, especially with families. And it may well be a great aspiration and hope that isn't materialised in envisaging the population taking to cycles. The only way, in my mind, that will happen is that if, for some reason, there's no fuel to drive the car. However, what I'm looking at is a return from the cyclists for the investment that's being planned. And by that I mean, if we determine safer routes, then the cyclist has to give up the freedom of going where they wish. For example, if we take Purley to Croydon, then there's a almost parallel road, Pampersford Road, etc., where cyclists could be designated as a cyclist route. Now, you could argue, of course, whether that's just any safer than the Brighton Road, but that's not the point. The point that I'm making is that if it were designated a route, then cyclists use it. They do not use Brighton Road. The cycle lanes would be removed or just ignored, but that sort of issue has to come into play. There has to be some discipline from cyclists as to where they are allowed to cycle in return for the public investment in safer routes.
Well, just for clarity,
that seems to me a point for consideration.
John, just for clarity, I just want to know your understanding. Who are roads for?
Well, I've got several points to develop. The second one is traffic lights and groups. Now, traffic lights, I noticed that when traffic lights are out of order, it is considerably safer. No traffic lights, traffic takes more care, it seems to go quicker, and cyclists benefit also because there's greater care. So perhaps we should be thinking about trying, experimenting with closing some of the traffic lights, turning them off, and monitoring what happens. The third point is it's very important, and I know we run campaigns about clothing with cyclists. Clothing, the lack of prominent clothing. It is very necessary that cyclists take some responsibility for wearing proper clothing. Even what I call the professional cyclists, like yourself, Mr. Chairman, avid cyclists, properly clothed. Some of them have very, very poor lights. There are on the market very good lights, blinkers, but some have very poor. And it is not helpful if the cyclists whom we're looking to protect do not help themselves. I hope that's been helpful, Mr. Chairman, to you in your capacity as a cyclist.
I look forward to you suggesting which set of traffic lights in Purley you'd like to switch the lights off. I look forward. No, I'm not. Okay. I'll wait for the officers. I don't know if any officer or anyone wants to respond to any of those points, or we'll just take them in.
I was going to respond to the point about low numbers of cyclists. I understand that each day this number of people travelling by bike in London is almost equivalent to the numbers on the DLR and the overground. But I called up one statistic to check, and TfL say that there are 645,000 cycle trips made in London each day, and that's equivalent to 1/5 of daily tube trips. That's the good news. I can't quite spot just at the moment the Croydon figure, but I think Croydon accounts for about 1% of that 645,000 cycle trips. What we highlighted was the potential is here. TfL has identified the Croydon Metropolitan Centre as the metropolitan centre in London with the greatest potential for cycling. But there does need to be a change in infrastructure to bring about that release of that potential.
I've just got a couple of other people first, and I'll bring you back in. Jan, and then Joy.
Okay, thank you. I spent my childhood in Lincolnshire, in the Fens area, and where it was everyone cycled. Well, many people, most people cycled, and so from an early age, first of all, I was on my father's bike, and then as soon as I could, I had my own bicycle and getting about, and it was, considered to be pretty safe in those days, of course, when the traffic was not as heavy as it is now. So I am very much in favour of the independence that young people can gain from an early age by actually having a bike and getting out to other places that they'd never be able to get to otherwise. Because you can't afford the fares or whatever reasons that there would be. So I think that's a really good idea. But I do think it's very important that we start early, and the easiest way of affecting people is really getting them early and getting them through the schools or their families, and making it easier so children can learn, and then they will grow up and be more confident in everything in cycling. I'm also councillor in the south of the borough, where we're obviously on the Downs, on the North Downs, and it isn't easy pushing up hills and things when you're not very fit, but you can always get off and walk. And I remember also in my younger days taking holidays in France and things where we would hire bikes, and if it was a hilly bit, with the children, we'd just get off and walk it and just make it part of a holiday and a bit of fun. So I think there are things that we should be considering as well, encouraging the schools more and encouraging in those situations. I think I'll leave it there for the moment, but I have got one or two other things I'd like to say afterwards.
I don't know if anyone want to come back. I mean, I think I just want to follow up on that one. I am very interested in e-bikes, having used a few abroad, and I have to say they are, when I try and cycle up South Nord Hill, I do think, oh God, I wish I had an e-bike now. But I do think it's a point well made about the south of the borough being hilly, and we mentioned the topography of it. And I do think that you know, actually councillors and officers are quite are sort of ambassadors potential of this programme. We need to be seen to be doing things as well as just saying it's a good thing. And I just wondered whether, I think we have e-bikes in the council. I don't know if anyone here, I don't know, Ian mentioned them, maybe it'd be worth, but I do think it would be good if we actually had an event for councillors with the use of e-bikes, because I think this, for many people, it's about the fear of cycling, but secondly, it's not feeling healthy enough. And I think it'd be quite good, be useful to hold a promotion so that councillors who've never seen an e-bike or want to return to counselling, that maybe we could, whether we could do a session before a council meeting or whatever, because I just think the potential among many of our council colleagues is actually quite high for cycling, but many of them may make the point that they live in a part of the borough where actually they think it's quite tough to, if you're just new to or returning to it after many years. So, any comments back on that or on the e-bikes generally?
Yes, in fact, Ian and I were just discussing e-bikes this afternoon because we were just, discussing the whole issue about the south of the borough being really quite challenging from a topography point of view. And it was interesting. I was thinking about, would I ever use an e-bike? And I think it does need some sort of promotional event, and that's what we were talking about. And Ian was saying there's a bike shop in Coulsdon that does e-bikes, and we should team up with it. Because what I think the real brilliance about e-bikes is that we've talked about, specific groups like men in lycra, etc., younger people who want to keep fit. But in terms of normalising the whole thing, it's about getting anybody and everybody on a bike. And the thing about e-bikes is it does allow people who are not as fit, who are older and all the rest of it, to have the independence of a bike, to enjoy the health benefits, but also to have the reassurance about getting up some of these hills that you've got a bit of extra help and push. And Ian was saying in Holland, for instance, where he saw several people who were of an older age, that they had special little carriers on their bikes for putting their walking sticks in, and they had electric bikes. And to me, that was just brilliant, because that totally brings cycling to everybody. There's no excuse not to cycle then with an e-bike. And the e-bikes have really come forward over the past few years in terms of making the battery smaller, and they're cheaper. So I'm totally with you on that one, and I think we should do a huge amount more, because of Croydon's topography, about e-bikes.
And I should say, when I did visit Stockholm a few weeks ago to look at their Vision Zero, one of their senior officers came along to the meeting, and when I met them afterwards, they had an e-bike, but it was set up to take the two young children to and from school. It was big enough. They could put their shopping in as well, but they had seats in it. So you can actually, it's a modified cargo type bike. So it is something that parents, I think, particularly can use as well. I think with the point that Patricia made about how do you ferry your children around, there is solutions now with modified e-bikes. Any comments on e-bikes? Anyone else? Otherwise, I'll move on to Joy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Start off with 3 or 4 not very coherent questions. Well, I think they'll be coherent individually, but they're not very sequenced. Just things that have popped into my mind reading the various papers. Firstly, the pollutants. I see the strand and certainly applaud it that says the more bikes and the fewer cars, the less pollution there will be. But I wonder, I would have thought that existing pollutants in the air would have been a barrier to people taking up cycling, along with the other barriers that we've been discussing. And I just wondered whether any thought has been given to perhaps, I know it's a bit of a chicken and egg vicious circle situation, but whether any thought has been given to how to get over that thought process of not wanting to perhaps wear a mask out on the road while you're cycling. And if you don't mind, a couple of other short questions, if I can group them. Secondly, I see there's a mention of the Mayor's transport strategy being put off until post the election, so I wondered if we had any timescale for that coming out now. Thirdly, there's mention of cycle hangers. As a sort of quick win, a number of cycle hangers have apparently been installed on housing estates. And I wondered whether there were any early results from that that could perhaps feed into this draft strategy. I mean, what is the usage so far? Are they a success? Are they being vandalised? Can I stop there and then ask two more later? Thank you.
Well, I think on the air quality, the papers yesterday said that driving your children around in your car, you're actually polluting the child more with the children inside the car than they are outside.
Yeah, it seems a bit counterintuitive. That
It is amazing counterintuitive, and actually, unless you're cycling right behind a lorry, health benefits, I have to say, I have checked this out myself, health benefits are better cycling, even on a day when the pollution is, than not to cycle, unless, of course, you have a severe health issue. But that is what my reading of it is, unless someone else wants to say differently. So the other 2 points we wanted was about an update on the mayoral strategy and about usage of cycle hangers if they have already been installed.
I understand the draft transport strategy is due to be published on the 19th of June. And I'm afraid I haven't brought any information on the use or damage to or otherwise of cycle hangers. So I'll go back to the office and ask, see if we have usage figures.
What I can tell you from my experience of working housing is that they are exceptionally popular normally. The issue is about, because ones, if they are the very robust ones, cycle storage, which I'll just raise this point here, which I think is much maybe for Stephen, is my experience of new builds properties is that the secure by design officers who sign off don't pay enough attention to cycle storage on new builds. Normally have a police officer in each borough who interprets cycle storage security for new builds. And my strong recommendation is that cycle storage has to have the same level of security as the main front door, which now means sort of steel frame doors rather than any fancy glass or wooden ones with double maglocks. I have sent this to Stephen previously about the anti-column about our new house building programme, that we don't make the mistakes that many people have made and build cycle storage that is prone to being vandalised and bikes stolen. So I think we need to increase the security there. Stuart?
Can I endorse that point and just highlight something that is referenced in the papers and that Scrutiny Committee may wish to address when it comes to consider its recommendations, and that is our concerns around cycle safety, the safety of cycles from theft, and in particular concerns we've got at the storage facilities at East Croydon. It's something that we raised when the Cycling and Walking Commissioner joined us on a tour of Croydon, and asked him to feed that back into the Met, because as we mentioned earlier, some cyclists spend quite a bit of money on their bikes, and I would imagine that that is, along with personal safety, cycle safety is a consideration about whether they would undertake certain journeys.
When we had the pre-application, whether it is on planning for the second Mentor scheme, which is the one replacing the 55-storey skyscraper, either that or the Royal Mail site seems to me to be the ideal place for a proper bike hub rather than an open-air facility on a side road, because it's quite clear from my experience that unless the cycle's in full view of everyone and people, it's either prone to vandalism or bikes being stolen, or people just won't use it. They just don't trust it. Again, I think we do need East Croydon Station. From my personal perspective, I don't know that I personally don't. I've very rarely ever left a bike at East Croydon. That just doesn't feels safe to me there, particularly if you're coming back late at night. If it was there for an hour or two, I probably would during the daytime, but that's not the way I do my commuting. Joy, you had some additional one.
There's two more topics. One is the reference in the papers to encouraging cycling in 3 specific parks, and then one of them is on the edge of my wall, so I was involved in that. And I wondered whether there are plans to have cycling in, whether to roll that out to other parks in Croydon. And then my last topic is I was a bit surprised not to see, a bit like Councillor Bottinger, more emphasis on getting them young, as it were, and education in the strategy. It's interesting to hear from the bikeability people about the number of children that they train, but I think it was something like 60% of schools. And so it's random, it circulates, it's voluntary, it seems to me. I know that schools, especially new ones, have to have sort of travel plans, but I would have thought that certainly in a 20-year strategy, and I certainly take Rachel's point about, starting with what you can do, but in a long-term strategy, I would have thought perhaps to address a possible barrier that it might exist in curriculum time, but something that would enable us to get more or less 100% coverage, if possible, amongst school children, and therefore to, as we've been saying, to normalise it as part of the culture. Thank you.
Any comments back, or just acceptance? Or
I think I would add, this is a strategy, I think associated with this, once the strategy is approved, is a delivery plan, and I would certainly expect in a delivery plan some hard KPIs and objectives that we can be measured against, so that, scrutiny, ourselves as the political leadership and others, stakeholders can measure whether we're making success on those strategic objectives. Certainly recognise completely the need to get them young.
I mean, I appreciate it's difficult. We don't run the schools anymore, but it might be harder to have KPIs for this than perhaps some of the other areas. But I just felt that at least in the vision and the aspirations, in the long term, perhaps, that I was a bit surprised that it wasn't made more of it.
I mean, I think we all agree that the school travel plans in Croydon have a lot of potential for improvement. So I'm going to bring Patricia in, but I saw Paul's hands go up, and I think he's probably the best person to speak to this subject, schools and cycle training.
So on the schools issue and participation, first of all, there's been a lot of effort to try and get cycling on the national curriculum, but it's currently not on the curriculum. So, it's always a discussion with the school about how much time they want to spend. The second issue is that the school travel plan process in some circumstances can give some financial benefit to the school for having cycle training, but not always. And that is something that, is run by TfL. So whether or not there's something the borough can do specifically around that is something I think Ian would have to think about, possibly. And the third thing is that there is a constant churn in terms of head teachers and Year 6 and Year 5 teachers in Croydon schools. So we're constantly remarketing all the time. And, one of the impacts of schools of the academy programme is that there's, they're less engaged with the local authority than perhaps they once were. And I think that's general across all of London. One of the programmes we run in other boroughs, for instance in Tower Hamlets, is we provide bikes for all the participants, so that any child is able to participate, and we train the whole school to the level they can achieve. Now, you know, Tower Hamlets has specific issues with terms of very high levels of index of multiple deprivation, so there is money to do that. But that is one way of bringing up the participation levels. But it's about policy. So those are my comments.
Can I comment on that? Because my daughter benefited from the scheme that you run and thought it was brilliant and was extremely enthusiastic. The only thing there are, as you say, when you're looking at academies, and as isn't, fortunately, in that respect, because I understand there is an issue of engagement with the local authorities, with the academies. And, of course, as you say, there's this issue with timing, as happens to be a primary school, and they really, they very much engage in environmental issues, cycling being one of them, and walking to school. And I don't know, I think probably because they have a fantastic incentive scheme for those individuals that are able to walk, even if it's part way to the school. But I'm not here to talk so much about that. I'm unfortunately just going to put a bit of a dampener on this, because it is a voluntary scheme. We can't do much about that, unfortunately, but we have to put this in perspective now, and I don't know how we're going to get round it at this moment in time, but we have to look at the cuts that are now going to be put upon our schools, and with that being the case, there is going to be less staff and therefore more pressure on those individuals, and possibly less time for our youngsters to actually do such things. That's my interpretation, unfortunately. And I'm just thinking, I don't know if we can do anything outside, possibly, of the curriculum hours, possibly in the lunch periods or whatever, so we can try and be a little bit more creative and try and incentivise the academies, not just the academies, because I don't really want to make them seem as though they're the worst, but it just so happens at this moment in time it is the academies that are not engaging as much as the other schools. But that's one of my first things that I wanted to speak about. The second... Can I have the answer to my Parks question? Coming back. This issue about, we look at car breakdowns, with there being, or foreseeing there being so many cars, but bikes on the road, maybe we should start looking then, and maybe it's not an immediate issue, as to what to do when bikes break down on the roads. Because, of course, the more you have, the more the possibility of that. And I also wanted to look at this. I love the idea, Jan, you mentioned our children being more independent, and I look and I think that would be brilliant, and I think it would be ideal. But I also then look at the possibility of more police possibly being out. And again, I know that that's something that we can't deal with here, but I'm just putting it in context again, because it used to be much more safe, I know, when I was younger, and I could walk to school by myself. But nowadays, especially with the amount of parents I know, the majority of those parents, I would say, they will hold their hands, metaphorically, from door to school and back again. And that's my concern as to, I don't know, it's a cultural thing possibly, or not sure, but it's having parents feeling that their children are safe without them being there.
Just briefly, one of the things that we are doing in Croydon is running holiday courses in the summer holidays. And relatively, they're very successful, more successful than you would expect. So we're doing them this summer. We'll probably train about 160 children. So that's about 10 primary schools worth. So, you know, it's interesting. There is, and this has been growing and growing and growing as it's more difficult, I think, for some schools to participate. And, you know, that's an area that we can look at expanding, hopefully.
Austin?
It occurs to me, listening to the proceedings, there's talk about outreach work, working with schools and individual families and travel plans being brought up. The area of Wadden I live, we've got 3 schools. We've got the 2 Croydon Minster schools, and we've got St Andrews. And so during term time, in the morning and in the afternoon, basically it turns into a huge rat run, and those parents who don't trust their children to get to school safely or whatever are the ones endangering other people by turning up in their 4x4s and driving at top speed and then dropping them off wherever they choose, parking in the zigzag lanes, etc., etc., etc. If we could do outreach work to schools and to individual families, I think it'd be quite helpful to show people how things could be. So if we show examples of good Dutch infrastructure and indeed good British, indeed good Croydon infrastructure where it exists, and ask them, would this sort of thing help you? Because I think there's a case where I mentioned culture earlier, we have an acceptance, a tolerance of bad driving. And I think if people get a vision, literally, of how things could be, it might persuade them to actually support the kind of measures we're advocating here, which would get cycling out of the ghetto and get cycling infrastructure. It's a terrible term, but I'm not sure there's a better description for it. Get that out so that people realise that's what you mean. So things that people see abroad when they go on holiday to Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, other places where these things are commonplace, and parts of London now, Enfield, Waltham Forest, indeed the embankment, as I mentioned earlier, they can actually see that that's what we could have in Croydon. I think then they'll start to become enthusiastic for it.
Thank you. We haven't had a response back to the parks question, but do you want, Robert, do you want to come back and then the parks question, or?
It's probably easiest if I say my bit now, because it follows on from what Austin is saying and the school's discussion more generally, and that surely when it comes to our cycling strategy, we should be targeting more of our effort on secondary schools rather than primary schools, as Councillor King was alluding to when he intervened. We need to pick the low-hanging fruit, go for the quick, easy wins to get Croydon up the league table of cycling success.
Ian?
On the cycling parks, Austin earlier on had requested that we build on or use the work undertaken for the Mini Hollands expression of interest. And we have continued to refine that work and appended to the report, I think at Appendix 2, there's a map showing routes proposed as part of an initial delivery plan. They're the ones we see as most important in terms of tapping the potential for the town centre. They're not necessarily the easiest to deliver. But what the Mini Hollands expression of interest and this strategy continues to envisage is a hierarchy of cycle routes with cycle highways at the top, where there needs to be some segregation as they're on busier roads. There's the quiet way concept with routes following quieter streets. But then within the draft strategy you'll see a plan that shows a network of fine green routes, and they are greenways, which perhaps the oldest concept. They sit in the Croydon local plan, and they are there to connect to and through the borough's green spaces. They are probably the finest network and the one that's probably technically easiest to deliver. We can and will be pursuing those in parallel with delivering the other quiet ways and principal cycle highways. But I'd suggest that the priority to tap the potential for the town centre has to be those cycleways and quiet ways.
In terms of the parks, I should be said that we have raised it last year, both with the Cabinet and for Culture, and I think it was mentioned previously, for a fundamental review of the parks bylaws, and I believe there is some movement on that. But personally, I just, if you want people to become confident in cycling, the first thing people normally do is go down their local park. And it seems sort of strange that that very activity is potentially in breach of a bylaw. And even if you're, and I know I, for one, and if anyone wants to catch me occasionally, I will cycle through South Nord Rec because it's significantly safer occasionally to cut through there than to do the Tennyson Road, Selhurst Road junction on occasion, especially during the rush hour time when you don't move, or if you're not, you have to sort of cycle on the pavement. So it just seems to be that, to me, that having a review of the the bylaws. I mean, we don't want people speeding through parks, but just unbanning it would be sensible. But there's also, I have to say, a number of these traditional council lanes that connect two roads, which most of them seem to have a sign saying no cycling on them. Again, if we're trying to get people to take the safer route, it seems balmy to bar the cyclists from that route, normally with a barrier at each end, which people with disabilities also find a difficulty to exit or enter these pathways. It's something I think the council should look at, because it's a set of laws going back to, 50 years ago plus.
I do think it's important that people do cycle in a courteous manner, though, in parks and things. Well, at all times, but certainly in the parks and things, because people there go often to relax, and they're not always looking out in the same way as they are along a footpath by a road and things. And obviously, there needs to sort of watching out for pedestrians and older people and everything else much more there than in other situations where they do have more of a right of way. I think all these things are really very important. The other point I wanted to make was about do we have any proposals to set up areas where people can hire bikes or borrow them? I have read recently an article where in some areas people donate their bikes, an old bike when they buy a new one and things, and the old bike gets done up and lent out to other people and things, or hired out and things. Because, I mean, it's quite an expensive business buying a new bike, and therefore if there were ones that we could lend to certain school groups, they could set up a club and, have little competitions even and things, because you think of how much publicity there's been over the last few years in the Olympics and everything, and you look on the roads in Surrey and everything, they're covered in cyclists at the weekend, which is great. But I think it's really important to encourage the younger children as well. Could you answer those 2 points, please?
On the latter point, it was one of the reasons why I was flagging up in my presentation the Yorkshire Bicycle Library. We have tried to bring bike recycling to Croydon on a small scale and with limited success, but the Yorkshire example seems to be one that is really thriving and is successful. And I'd suggest that it's something we need to learn more from. And certainly look seriously as it is a concept we can bring to not just to Croydon but to South London.
And I should say that I think there was a point that Patricia made about bikes breaking down, and I have to say, as someone who has managed to break a number of bikes or flat tyres, the number of bike shops across South London has dramatically improved. Some of them actually serve coffee at the same time, which I find. You don't normally have to walk too far with a flat tyre compared to what you used to do in the old days, I have to say.
Is that working? Just on cycling in parks, somebody asked for a KPI. I got a figure of 26 kilometres for all the cycle routes in parks which were mentioned in the Croydon plan. I mean, that is a huge number. I think the report that went to Cabinet and the routes we're due to implement just over the summer will do sort of about 2 kilometres of cycle routes. And that's one of the things we've been working with colleagues, is to make sure we do get the speeds and the enforcement and other things right, rather than just release 26 kilometres of routes to people and see what happens. So they're very much an experimental sort of first phase, and we're looking to do more.
Actually, I don't disagree with that. I disagree with that. I really think that is such old-fashioned way of dealing with a policy that we've got 3 cycle paths where we've effectively agreed a 10-mile limit. That seems to be the suggestion. Just go ahead with the other 24. What are we going to say? That we're going to allow 20 mile an hour on some of those other ones? To me, it's just bureaucracy, really slow. It must just as easy to put a change of bylaw in for a number of parks than it is for 3. It still has to have the same documents that go to a meeting to be approved. You know, Tom, I think you do a great job, but I really am not impressed, right, with that one. I'm sure some people are, but I'm certainly not impressed.
I just would say...
I'll let somebody else answer that.
Just would say that if you introduce things gradually, they generally are more accepted than if you just force it on everybody and rush it. But I do understand your point, but I think more of a gradual approach is likely to be more acceptable to people. Prepared better.
Stephen?
So just to pick up the point about bylaws, you're right, it was raised at previous scrutiny and we gave commitment that we would review them.
Timescale?
So that's going to be done through this financial year.
With regards to the hiring or the, let's say, recycling of old bikes, again, through personal experience and the school that my daughter happens to go to, which I shan't mention, they do that sort of thing, not the school itself. Actually, they have encouraged an organisation to come down and sell recycled bikes, and that was taken up really, really well by parents. I don't know where it is, but I thought it was based in Crystal Palace, and I'm not sure if the our council have some sort of input in that, but it's a brilliant scheme. So whatever is happening, it seems to be going well. I'm sure there were many parents I know at the time just couldn't get the sizes that they want, but I'm sure that would really do extremely well across the borough. Can I also use the opportunity to actually go back to the cycle hangers, which I think is fantastic, hearing as well that there's going to be another 34 planned, thought was brilliant, and it said funded, and that obviously prompted me to then think, where was the funding for the last lot? Was it the Section 106 money? And also, where is that funding coming from?
What helped get us started on the programme was a small amount of funding from TfL, but now it's 100% from Section 106 and has largely been funded out of Section 106 most recently.
But I imagine there's also a push from council tenants themselves, because with fire safety legislation and fire brigades not wanting cycles in communal hallways, there must be pressure from residents themselves for secure storage. So I don't know whether that will come through in the future. We're just going to run through some of the final points, which I think are in the paper that haven't been discussed. I was emailed by Councillor about Quiet Way 7, which is currently being reviewed. For those who don't know, Quiet Way 7 is being the Waterloo to Crystal Palace link. And as we know, Crystal Palace is as much in as an area is effectively the Upper Nord area of this borough. So we've got a TfL-funded programme through to Crystal Palace, which is at the moment being called in by the scrutiny committee in Lambeth for a check. There is, for me, one of the questions that the councillor raised with us is that, you know, if the Quiet Way 7 does end up in Crystal Palace, one of my big bugbears is actually, which was mentioned by Austin, is that, you know, the place I feel most unsafe is cycling through from East Croydon up to Upper Norwood. So what would our plan be to connect up to these routes that have been funded by the Mayor up to central London? Because looking at your proposal, there isn't really a funded route or a proposed route to Crystal Palace, because what's currently available is just a set of white lines on the side of South Nord Hill.
Programme, or the the drawing is Appendix 2 that sets out the Croydon proposed network of quiet ways and cycle highways isn't dependent on anything that might be being proposed at the City Hall TfL level. Hopefully we'll be able to access some quiet way funding, but we want to move at a much greater pace than the trickling out of quiet ways throughout London has been going ahead so far. It also envisages, well, it realises that Croydon is special. It needs a network focused on its town centre. But it also acknowledges that one of those routes needs to be up and towards Crystal Palace. And I'm glancing at Tom's drawing as he's calling it up now and trying to spot if one of those routes goes up through South Norwood Lake. But if it does, that's my preferred route up towards Crystal Palace. And personally, I suggest that that would make a good quiet way.
But you have to go through Bromley then, and they've never been particularly lined up in, well, my experience. But no, they have. They've got some wonderful routes going out the neck, but up in the Enderley area, it all seems rather neglected. Okay, so as I said, it just seems strange that we would have a potential quiet way coming to Crystal Palace, which we don't connect to, because it would seems to be that there wouldn't be much of a link between what's proposed up in the South Norwood area to link it to the Church Road triangle area. The other ones that people have mentioned as a fear, and it's something that correspondence is about the tram lines themselves. For some people riding through Croydon Town Centre, I personally myself around East Croydon Station, not a great fan of riding over tram lines. There's been some fear. People have raised concerns about them. I mean, travelling along the Eddiscombe Road, past the Lebanon Road tram stop, the cycle lane sort of, there isn't much room for the cyclist. Is there any proposals about how we are making cycling along tram lines in the town centre that bit safer?
I'm guessing that TfL Tramlink might believe I have shares in a company called Strail. They make something called VeloStrail, which is intended to make it easier and safer to cross rail and tram tracks. TfL and Tramlink, though, have looked into it, and it's not a product that can be retrofitted. The system has to be designed from day one, has to have foundations available to take this system. I know that TfL have also looked at inserts to go into the grooves in tram rails. The challenge there, though, is you need something firm enough that can take the weight of a cyclist, but also be capable of springing straight back once a tram has compressed it almost to the bed of the rail. So there doesn't seem to be anything out there that's readily available. We're working closely with TfL on the design of the second town centre loop for the town centre. And what we're ensuring there is that the current rather inadequate cycle route down Dingwall Road would get replaced by an at-standard segregated cycle route down Dingwall Road to make sure that the cyclists aren't mixing it with the trams and the tram rails.
I think that sounds very good. Just running through any other issues, local streets, cycling through London. I think I've covered most of my points. Anyone else got any other questions? Otherwise, I'll be drawing this to a close in terms of this stage, apart from final comments. Okay. So, is there any, Councillor King, is there any final comments that you want to make on this? Because what we're going to do is actually try and come up with some recommendations. If not, I want to say thank you to all the people who have attended. You can wait for us to do our recommendations, but you may want to take this opportunity to leave. I have to say, I think this strategy is as good as one could hope for from the position that we're starting from. Ideally, this would have been done 10 years ago, and we'll be able to maybe talk about some other more adventurous stuff that we could be doing. But there is a point that Councillor Hay-Justice made about the issue about resources, and which you've also made. I do hope that the new Mayor of London significantly increases resources for cycling for outer London, because I know the potential is always to keep putting money in central London because that's where the low-hanging fruits for him is. But he does rely on suburban votes to vote for or against him, so I hope we remind him that occasionally as well. So, Councillor King, have you got any other final comments? Or?
Only in response to your last point, Chair, which is there is a growing cross-party group of us who represent outer London boroughs who attend the London Council's Transport and Environment Committee, which meets on Thursday, and we are regularly within our groups and within the full meetings of TEC making the case when TfL and others come to us not to forget the London boroughs. We accept the low-hanging fruit point, but we also point out that we have a role to play, with a commitment to play that role, but we do need recognition through funding from the Mayor and TfL.
If those people who want a chance to leave, they can go. Otherwise, we've just got to do our recommendations and finish off some other items of work. Thank you. Okay, so people, I think overall, I don't think anyone disagreed with anything within the strategy. I think so. What the very first thing is that we make that point that we endorse the strategy and the points within it. I think I'd like these are in no particular order, and so we may reorder them once they get them because we don't want to imply. But I wrote down in an order. I thought Rachel Flower's points that sometimes we focus on the traffic accident, but actually we don't focus on people whose lives are saved by physical exercise like cycling. And I thought from the Healthy Croydon perspective that was something that we sometimes. I think Croydon should promote that.
There should be joined up departmental thinking, because the educational side should come in as well.
Yeah. We didn't. I was pleased enough that both Stephen and Heather and Rachel was here. E-bikes. I think particularly due to the topography of this borough, I welcome the commitment from the councillor and from the head of planning, whatever it is, or regeneration, to look at promotion of e-bikes. Because I think if you live in Upper Norwood or in South Norwood Hill or in Norbury, but in the south of the borough, e-bikes are the way forward. And it is the case. 25% of bikes in Holland are e-bikes, and that's a flattish country. And I think that will overcome one of the barriers that people have. I think it's right that they concentrate on the low-hanging fruit, the town centres, the short bicycle rides, as much as I'd like to get a better route to London through Croydon. Overall, the better thing is short car journeys are bad for the environment and bad for person's health. Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's as a short-term kick-starting measure. We support that. I welcome the comments of Paul from Bikeability about the fact that some of their programmes do actually in effect, target BME communities. And the work that they've done with the Lake Foundation. I think that should be commended. We did try to get the Lake Foundation here, but they just couldn't make the event. That these, yeah.
There was also a multi-faith cycling event that you saw Muslims, exactly, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, of, you know, different.
I think the point made about school travel plans, we know that they have restrictions on them, but I still think it's something that we should be encouraging schools to look at doing cycle proficiency, even though they've got all these restrictions and funding issues. Because, as someone said, it is about getting someone young and the training. Then, as I said, we've heard that there's a review, we welcome a review of the parks bylaws, but in particular to make certain that it's courteous cycling. No, I'm not disagreeing. Yeah. No, parents. If driving around in 2 or 3 tons of steel, that's dangerous. But anyway, let's move on.
Children.
I think the hiring of, and things, I think that should be linked in with one of your earlier points, I think, to make this opportunity, and borrowing free as well, and also in schools, and also encouraging somebody to set up a club, say, you know, if you've got a reasonable sized field and things on your site, I know probably only in the south, but maybe some places in the north as well. I can't remember off the top of my head, but you know there could be a cycling club in it or someone's largest playground.
So what we would say is that we think the council should investigate how it can support either bike libraries or bike hires to encourage people who don't have a bike to give it a go. Yeah. And finally, I would also like to make a recommendation that that the officers organise an event how the councillors can have a go. No. That's what I'm saying. That we organise an event in terms of e-bikes, in terms of e-bikes and ordinary bikes, to see so that councillors are leading the field, not say as we do. You know, so let's act as well as saying. Yes, they would have to. They would have to bring bikes for us. Yes. Yeah. On your bike. Okay. So anything else? Otherwise, we're going to. Yeah. I think we welcome all proposals that would encourage a take up of cycling, particularly those who have never done it or are returning to cycling after many years. Yeah. Maybe that's a Thomas phase. Okay. we're going to move on. Guys, we haven't finished yet, and we're on the webcast still and all that, so I want to finish. So we're going to finish item 8. Item 9 of the agenda, which is a stage 2 scrutiny recommendations. So these are the responses from officers. Councillor Speakman had a point regarding item response on number 7 regarding paint.
Well, I've looked on the site. I don't see anything on the site. There's reference there to what the instructions are going to be. I'll wait and see what happens there. But my main concern is the fact that recycling centres do not take paint, waste paint. And that seems to me wrong, and they ought to. And I think that we should see what the explanation is.
Can I suggest that it's been accepted as a recommendation by the Cabinet member, and that can we potentially get a copy of what the bulletin or what has actually been agreed and circulated it? Yes. Maybe we can feedback that if you go to a recycling site, you may not actually see the sign or something. But let's get what was circulated again to us. Okay, so we note those acceptance. If that's it, then I close the meeting. Thank you very much for the first meeting of the Streets Environment Home Scrutiny Subcommittee for this financial year. Thank you.
One question. Why is it we're not able to see what is being videoed?
It's because, unfortunately, the projector is not working this evening, which is why we were using the TV screen for the presentation.